Welcome to another episode of Thrive. We've got a very special episode here today because we're talking about managing creative teams with none other than Karl Sakas. Karl, thanks so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Kelly, great to be here.
So Karl is a lot of things, but Karl is an agency leader for sure, an author, a speaker, a consultant to creative teams across the globe. I think the teams lovingly refer to you as their agency therapist or the Dr. Phil of their agencies, right? So that's great. And just from a personal standpoint, I feel like, my own values and the holistic approach that I take with clients is very much aligned with yours. So I really enjoy the fact that we're kind of developing this relationship, and just really great to talk to you today.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, so let's dive in. You actually wrote this amazing book that you sent me. It's a little pocket book called Made to Lead, a pocket guide to managing marketing and creative teams. And, in the book, and I've known this as well, how you got your start, you kind of received like a 360-degree review from your peers, and that
Yes.
sort of led to the creation of the book. So can you share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I learned from the 360 reviews, maybe to summarize, I was good at getting things done, good at getting results, but not at making it fun for everyone I was working with. So it was just results, 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 and not thinking about morale. And that was definitely a reality check for me. And I realized, okay, I'd gotten to a certain point. I couldn't go from there if I didn't change how I worked. And I've shifted that since then.
Yeah, greatly.
Yes.
So also you talk a little bit about the leaders eat last mentality, which, obviously Simon Sinek has kind of popularized that with his own book. But I feel like there are people that just inherently know that for whatever reason. And then there are people that have to be taught that.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the difference between a leader or a manager, which I know you use synonymously, at an agency where they really see their teams in sort of this hero role, and then they see themselves in this helper role, and why that
Right.
can be difficult for some people to really wrap their heads around?
Well, people tend to think a lot about themselves. Not that they're necessarily narcissists, although some people are, of course. But it's easy to focus on yourself. But when you do that, you're not focused on your team. You're not focusing on their potential, helping them contribute what they can. And I got the Leaders Eat Last message from my dad 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I was at an event where one of the it was involved in Boy Scouts, where one of the scout leaders ran to the head of the buffet line and was pushing people out of the way. And his comment from his experience going to West Point, 20 years in the Army, you always make sure that the people that report to you are taken care of first before you eat. Hence,
Right.
what Simon Sinek has now turned into the Leaders Eat Last concept.
Right.
But that's been in the military for decades.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the analogy that I have, or how that resonates with me, is that I saw my grandmother, who was sort of the matriarch of the family, making sure that, she cooked a meal for us at holidays. She made sure
Yeah.
everybody had their place settings and everyone had at least one serving before she even thought about sitting down. And
Yeah.
so that's what I meant earlier by, it's inherent in the fact that some people just see that growing up and they sort of internalize
Right.
it and realize, oh, she's the leader of the family. This is what she does. She makes sure everyone's okay first, and then she'll
Yeah.
kind of go for herself.
A way to think about it is if, as you're running your agency, think back when you had a boss, when you were an employee, think about your best bosses. Those were probably bosses that were focused on you, helping you reach your potential rather than only focused on themselves.
Right, right. One of the things that I also really resonated with in the book was this whole idea of stop expecting your team to read your mind. So I
Yeah.
really want to kind of dive into this because I personally see it all the time with agency leaders getting frustrated by the fact that their employees are not meeting their own expectations. But then when
Right.
you ask, have you communicated those expectations to them? It's like, oh, no. So
Yeah.
just love to talk a little bit about that.
It's easy to be in something of an echo chamber. If you're working with your executive or management team, you've probably been talking about things for weeks or months, and you've talked through all the angles and you've reached a decision. but the rest of your team has no idea. They haven't been through that process. So really it's thinking about from a change management perspective when you're implementing big changes, but it applies even on a day-to-day basis. And I have a framework that I use that I call values, goals, and resources, VGRs. That is, if your team knows the values to follow, that is what's important as they're working, what they should and shouldn't do. If they know the goals, both for the agency and for the work they're doing, and the resources in terms of finances, in terms of time, people, so on. If they know the VGRs, they can make decisions without you. In that case, it's almost like they're reading your mind, but you certainly shouldn't assume.
Right, right. And so I like to also say it maybe a slightly different way, but it's the same concept.
Yeah.
Kind of this whole idea of frameworks over formulas, right? So giving people
Mm-hmm.
that expandability or whatever you want to call it,
Yep.
where the leadership team and the management kind of communicates. They put together a framework and goals. They communicate that from the top down, but then the solutions are really coming from the bottom up. And I think it's that dichotomy and that balance, that intersection. I think that's where all the magic happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about communication issues at agencies. I think we could probably have one whole entire show dedicated to this.
Yes. Maybe a whole series.
A whole series, yeah. So for me, it's definitely the number one issue at any agency. And I feel like it comes from a lot of different places. Maybe account people and project managers sort of over-promising to clients without talking to the creative team or the production team. A lot gets lost in translation when we have things like, Slack and email and project management systems and all of that. So not that we're going to fix communication issues in one dialogue here, but just maybe talk a little bit about some of the experiences that you've seen with agencies and how maybe they've overcome some of those communication issues.
Yeah. Well, here's something not to do. I learned that a client would do what his team called desk side briefings. He would close a new client, he would come out of his office, and he'd grab a random person and say, here's what you need to know about this new project. Right. The person wasn't even necessarily the one who'd be leading it, but he'd just dump the information out to them. And then he would walk away having forgotten everything he just said, totally cleared it out of his head. Right. And now the hapless employee was expected to turn it into reality. Obviously, a lot of challenges with that. Yeah. One of the biggest things I see is a difficult handoff between the sales process and the project management process. Mm-hmm. One of the easiest ways to fix that is to have your project manager at the last sales meeting. So the last conversation you have, you've done a proposal, the client's likely to move forward. So it's not a billable meeting, but it's pretty likely to lead to a billable engagement. Right. Have the PM there so they're not meeting the client's not meeting them for the first time at the kickoff meeting. Mm-hmm. The biggest challenges I see in communications are around those transition points. Right. Data, you can have a lot of day-to-day issues, but that handoff is often where people drop the baton. Right. So if you can add more of a formal process to that, it doesn't have to be incredibly complicated, but recognize there's a big risk at that point. Don't just treat it like another day at the office.
Right. And it's also helpful for the client communications as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what about that choice that we all kind of have day to day in the agency where we're trying to figure out what's the best method of communication? Is it an in-person? Is it a phone call? Is it an email? What are some best practices that you like to advise about?
My continue on that is that if you're having a difficult or potentially contentious conversation, lean more toward doing that verbally, whether it's in person or via video or via phone. And the idea there, whether that's an internal conversation or client conversation, if you've got some difficult news to deliver, or if you need a decision and you're not sure exactly how it's going to go, by doing it in real time, that would be a synchronous conversation. By doing it in real time, you're able to adjust for the nuances. You're able to adjust based on what they say in response to what you said. On the other hand, if it's something that's not contentious, if it's more of a status update kind of thing, I would shift more toward asynchronous. So depending on your setup, that could be sharing it in Slack. It could be sharing something in your project management system. It could be sending an email. Of course, the challenge is if you're emailing everything, you get email blindness and people start ignoring things. So if it's less critical, less timely, in that case, something asynchronous like email or post an update or what have you can work. A key way to make life easier is to have an internal, think of it as a service level agreement, SLA, on how fast people should respond in certain formats. For instance, if someone texts you, is that an urgent response thing or can it wait a few hours? Right. Are you setting the expectations that emails are instant response? That's probably not a good idea. But if you can come to an agreement as to what the responsiveness should be, it makes life easier for everyone, certainly less stressful.
Right. And then also, I think what's sort of like an obvious sort of follow-up question to that, or follow-up comment or discussion is, I mean, I remember working with a couple of different PR firms, and for whatever reason, PR firms, just in my experience, this could be different with your experience, but in my experience, they don't really embrace project management systems the same way that a web development organization would, right? So what they tend to do is they love email distribution groups, right? So you've got, let's say 6 people working on an account, and every email has everybody copied or part of this distribution group, even if they're not necessarily needing to take any action based on this piece of communication. I've always felt like that was if I could design the least effective way to communicate, that would be it. And I don't know why PR firms in general, have you seen something like that? You have the same experience?
I have, and that's something unusual about PR-oriented agencies, which is that they tend to merge what I look at as the 3 client-facing roles: account management, project management, and subject matter experts. So you've got the same person, and they'll often have an account executive, account manager type title. They're doing client service, the account management piece, keep clients happy. They're doing project management, the internal coordination with their team to get it done. And they're often the subject matter expert in giving PR advice and being an expert on the client's industry, sorting out strategy and all. And so when you have one person doing all of those roles, they're going to tend to be better at one rather than the other. It's hard to, even if you're a great project manager, it's hard to project manage yourself. And so if you've got one person doing all of that, and so I think to some extent the let's CC everyone on everything is that everyone has all of these different roles, and it's not always clear who needs to know what at what time. So let's just tell everyone about everything in the idea that will somehow fix it, which it doesn't.
Right. So in a situation like that, I'm curious, would you recommend sort of a process for the email communications and then probably putting in place a project management system? So there is sort of that pull apart between the two?
Definitely better to have a PM system where you can choose who's getting updates on what, but everyone has access. So if they miss something, they can search there first rather than saying, hey, what happened on that? And, for instance, my PR firm uses Basecamp as a PM system, so everyone knows what's going on. And there is a distribution list, but that's more of like if I'm emailing someone externally, I'm able to copy that and they're able to get the update because, I'm not adding an external person to the Basecamp thread.
Right. That makes sense. So let's shift a little bit and talk about staffing and employees and sort of the future of what we might see as the agency model. I know in the book you talked a little bit about, the fact that if you're a FaceTime boss, which I love that term, sort of embrace it, but also accept the fact that you are going to attract and retain lower quality employees. And I thought it was a really bold statement, but there's so much truth to it. So I just wanted to sort of wind down the conversation talking a little bit about staffing and that aspect of on-site versus virtual.
So, for sure, people have different preferences versus agencies being in an office versus remote. If you're in a large metro area, you can, build a good team of everyone in the same office. On the other hand, if you want to find the best people available who may not be choosing to live in your city or in your metro area, that's where virtual comes in. I will say it is a lot harder to be a boss or a manager or a leader at a virtual agency than an in-person one. Because if you're all in person, communications can come down to turning and telling someone to do something. That doesn't scale beyond a certain point, but you don't have to be as good at communicating. You don't have to be as good as setting expectations when everyone's in one room or one space. So if you're willing to accept the challenge of communicating better and upping your skills as a manager, running a more virtual agency does let you get the best people, but it's harder. There are a lot of benefits to being in one room.
Yeah. Do you have sort of a, not a decision tree, I won't even go that far,
Mhm.
but something to say, certainly from an elasticity standpoint, maybe
Mhm.
these are employees that are virtual and not necessarily full time.
Mhm.
Just the elasticity of the staffing or of the employees in general, I think, that can really sort of impact profitability as well.
Yes.
If they're not on site, they're using their own computers. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many different things that I feel certainly the direction that agencies are moving in is having a smaller staff on site and then sort of creating that elastic team with some virtual employees.
I see that with many of my clients, certainly not all of them.
Right.
These are agencies anywhere up to about 100 people or so. So, it's different when you have 50 employees versus 10 employees
Yep.
for sure. But certainly anything you can do to make the agency more flexible helps. Whether that's shifting toward more of a pod-based team structure, or having a team that's spread out, so you have the challenge of potentially different time zones, but that's also a benefit too. I
Right.
have a client that worked with one of their employees for several years, based in New England, and they said, what, they wanted to move to Australia. Well, on one hand, that makes it harder to do meetings in terms of, the window there.
Right.
On the other hand, they can assign her stuff. She works on it during the day, her time. It's overnight in the US, and it's done in the
Right.
morning.
Right. So basically, you're saying there are pros and cons to everything. You just kind of have to,
Yes.
see what works for your agency and see, where you want to go with that.
Yes, and keeping in mind that there are a lot of things you can do to make things easier, where it's using different frameworks, different shortcuts. Managing an agency is never going to be easy, but it doesn't have to be so hard.
Well, I think this audience in particular would agree with that 110%. So, Karl, thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that Made to Lead is available on Amazon, right? It's in
Yep.
paperback and on Kindle. And you also have something that you extend that into 30 days worth of emails. Can you just touch upon that?
Yes, yeah. So, the book is helpful. People say they'll read it in 20 or 30 minutes,
Yeah.
but you still need to have from my perspective, a daily reminder.
Hmm.
And so I created a free email series, 30daymanager.com. You can sign up and get an email every workday for a month, reminding you about different tips so that, you get it first thing in the morning, and you can look for ways to apply it that day. We're all getting better as managers every day.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, definitely sign up for that. I will put that in the show notes. And thank you so much. This is just such a great conversation, and love to keep it going.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kelly.